To pick up where we left off from last time, we're going to discuss the difference in themes in regards to how they're presented. In Soma, the game has themes which are presented primarily through story, meaning dialogue, cutscenes, and other things that just present the story to you as is without any supplemental material. For all intents and purposes, the story elements in Soma can be readily reproduced in the form of a book, movie, or TV show. In fact, I believe there's even a short series called Transmission based on the events of Soma and is supposed to take place in the same universe. Feel free to check that out if that is appealing to you, because then you can have some of these. The point I'm trying to convey is that while Soma does tell an amazing story, it is one that does not need to be told through a video game in order to send its messages across, with the sole exception of the points where you have to make very gray moral decisions. As one example, here's some footage of a woman that you come across. The disease that is infected the station is actually a physical manifestation of a program that is flooded throughout the entire section of the station. It's called the WAU, the W-A-U, and its sole function in this sort of post-apocalyptic scenario is to keep its occupants alive. And its definition of alive does not always mean comfortable, happy, or even necessarily human. With this particular girl, her lungs were no longer functioning, so it created artificial lungs and strapped them to her. So she's alive, and it's keeping her alive, but she can't move and she's in a lot of pain. And you have a decision as to whether or not you want to kill her or keep her alive, because you must at least pull one of two cords in order to progress. If you pull one cord, this keeps her alive but in very much pain. And if you pull two cords, it kills her. You need to remove at least one to progress. That is something that would not necessarily be possible in a film, but you could make do. To convey this in relation to the Swapper does not have a significant amount of dialogue. It doesn't have a significant amount of story. Most of the game consists of you navigating an abandoned spaceship, and only bare minimum interaction with other characters. And a lot of the game's story is presented through text logs, sort of diary entries left behind by previous crew members, and these strange things called watchers, which are these stones that show words on the screen whenever you pass in front of them. The premise of the game is relatively simple. You are on a space station. You are ejected from this space station in a pod, against your will, and shot down to the planet below. You get out, you find a device known as the Swapper, and use this for platforming and puzzle segments in order to unlock doors and proceed forward in a sort of Metroidvania-style adventure. The thing to note, though, is this game is strange in the way that it approaches some of these themes. A lot of times, if you've seen my previous work on this channel, I discuss horror and the way that games can approach themes of horror and scary elements. The thing with this particular game, though, is that it does it in a unique way. It does it in a way that's very thematic and symbolic, as opposed to, say, atmospheric. What I mean by that is there's not a lot of dreary, dreadful music. There's not really any jump scares. There's no excessively horrific imagery. The most that you get is the way that the game presents itself visually, which is a lot of long, dark shadows, a lot of intense light from light sources that contrast these shadows, and a lot of drab, gray, industrial-looking areas. Think of Dead Space in regards to the kind of architecture you're going to be encountering. The game gives an excessively strange look in the fact that almost all the in-game assets are actually photographs or scans of real-world objects or clay objects that were molded to be the scenery for this game, and then used bump mapping in relation to the flashlight that you use in the game. This gives it an eerily photorealistic view, similar to, say, certain kinds of claymation, but with the standard 60 FPS of most, if not all, PC games. But yet, it doesn't try to scare you, is the point I'm trying to get across. Although it does do things that can be scary to people, which we will discover as we discuss this game further. One thing to note about the swapper itself, the tool, are its functions, and this is key to understanding how this game delivers its concepts primarily through gameplay, as opposed to story. Because story is still relevant in regards to how it delivers its themes of transhumanism and consciousness, but it is not the primary way that it delivers these concepts in a way that will make the player, and thus you, contemplate them. The way that it contemplates them is through these two mechanics. Number one, it allows you to create clones of yourself that will mimic your every motion to the letter. This even includes motions that you are unable to perform yourself, such as if you are running into a wall, the clone will still run in the direction you are attempting to run, and vice versa. The second function, however, is where things get a little more technical. You are able to eponymously swap into the bodies of the clones that you have created at any moment, as long as you are within line of sight of them. You can create up to 4 clones, meaning 5 bodies with 1 body always containing your consciousness within it. And these copies will disappear under 3 circumstances. Number 1, if you enter or exit an area under one of these lamp lights, they will all disappear. If one of them runs into you or you run into them, they will also disappear. If they perform an action that is fatal to them, which primarily consists of either being crushed or falling from a fatal height, then they will also disappear. This is a common method for approaching the puzzles in these games, in that when you have too many clones around, you will force one of them to perform a fatal action so that you can create a new clone from your current location. Now, for the most part, this seems relatively mundane, in the sense that there are many games in which you create a copy of yourself in order to solve puzzles. However, the game has a few interesting perspectives on this. In order to help understand these perspectives, we need to delve a little bit into an earlier mentioned element of this game, which is the Watchers. Whenever you approach these stones, text appears in front of them, and at first they're very strange, cryptic, enigmatic, so to speak, and it's hard to figure out what it means, but once you proceed further into the game, you start to figure out a little bit as to why they are saying the things that they say. It's revealed that these stones are sentient beings that operate in a form of a pseudo-hive mind. They are a hive mind in the sense that they all can sense and understand the thoughts of the other stones that are close to them, but they still retain their individual thoughts, even if they do share cognition with all these other stones. We know about this individuality because of the rock saying things that others do not, such as one that states that it has a different belief than all of the other minds in the chain, so to speak. And this is where another important aspect is revealed. The Watchers do not have a comprehension of physical space, and they do not have a comprehension of death. Here is an example of a quote from one of the Watchers that details some of these ideas. You see, on its own, this probably would not make very much sense. It sounds like complete gibberish. But once you understand that these beings do not have the ability to comprehend physical space due to not having any sensory organs whatsoever, it becomes a little bit more clear about how their consciousness works. And it becomes especially strange because of their ability to recognize and even communicate their thoughts to other sentient beings, including humans. This is how they have come across these various concepts, death being a primary one. They had not considered the concept of death, as until the humans arrived, they were merely rocks sitting on a planet, and since they're not biological beings, they do not have these terms such as an expiration date, death, passing away, etc. And until the humans took them away onto the ship for experimentation and research, they had not known what it was like to be separated from the other minds in this chain. And it was through the research of these Watchers that they were able to develop the Swapper device, because in the instance in which they have these minds in the chain, they were able to develop the concept of transferring consciousness from one location to the other. However, we come across a little bit of a snag with this game in a fashion very similar to the ones that we have discussed in Soma. Something that's discovered very late in the game is that when you create a copy of yourself, it is not technically what one would consider a copy, so to speak. And I mean it is not a copy in the sense that it is not a giant sack of flesh that is identical to you, that is easily disposable in the same sense that, say, a robot might be, but in the sense that it is not just a mindless puppet. To delve into how we discover this, you're shown a flashback of sorts from earlier in the game. It shows a character who we've been following throughout this game, and it shows them using the Swapper device. And when they use it, we find out that they had created a copy of themselves. And in a panic, they had sealed it into an escape pod and launched it to the planet below. That might sound familiar to you. This is from very early in the game, and it is in fact the very first things that we see in the game. It's this moment in which we discover that we are not ourselves, in the sense that we are not a unique individual, but we are a clone of the person who we had been chasing the whole time. We assumed that this was a different person from the mere notion that the only identifying characteristics we have are these spacesuits, which it would be entirely plausible to assume that this person is a different person wearing the same model of spacesuit as us, just like any other team of astronauts would. And they discuss this as well. The thing is, as far as we can tell, the ability for the Swapper to create these clones also comes with it a function that is not discussed, a sort of hidden third function, which is to be able to control the physical actions of the other copies that are made. But it has a limited range to it, so that as soon as it ejects you, you have your own autonomy once again. This creates a sort of startling revelation, the specific revelation that when you create these copies, you're creating clones, and all of them are actually sentient. We know this because the actions that your character takes are completely independent of anything that the person who made you, the original copy of you, wants you to take. And this becomes very eerie in the sense that the tutorial levels, and for a majority of the levels in the game, require you to sacrifice, if not outright kill, severely high number of these copies in order to proceed. The tutorial level itself actually presents multiple situations in which you are forced to have your copy wander into a bottomless pit with a very sickening crunching sound as they fall to the ground, most likely snapping their neck or their spine. And this in and of itself is relatively terrifying. The fact that you are creating people, brand new people who are equally sentient, equally alive as you, and they're unable to control their body. And that two things are going to happen to them. The first thing that could happen to them is that they are manipulated. Their body is moving around beyond their control, and that they die. They fall to their death, they get crushed, or they just dissipate into thin air once you leave the room. The second situation is more terrifying in that you learn that the swapping mechanic actually allows you to transfer consciousness in addition to swapping with the current one. This is shown in the event in which the swapper was first used. The astronaut who you are chasing had accidentally swapped her mind with that of a brain in a jar. And so the mind of the astronaut is no longer present in this body. It's in the mind of the jar that we see about halfway through the game. And this is relevant because the second thing that can happen to these clones of yours is that moments after they have been spawned into existence, with their body being completely beyond their control, their mind will then be whisked away into another identical but yet completely different body from their own, and you take their body and then you leave with. I mean, it is still the same body, but it's not the one that you were born in. I just want you to imagine that in any other scenario. You're standing there, say, with a good friend of yours, and then all of a sudden, you're now in your friend's body, and then, beyond your control, your body moves in such a way in which you are guaranteed to die, and your friend leaves the room. It's a terrifying notion, a very strange concept. But there's one that can be even more terrifying for other people, and this is where we get down to the brass tacks of this transhumanism thing. The thing is that the swapper does not actually care in regards to the original body, so to speak. The introduction of the swapping mechanic is shown in a room in which you have to navigate it through a pit in which you can safely land at the bottom without getting hurt, but you are not able to traverse to the top without swapping out of your body. This creates an issue in that you are unable to leave the room with the body that you came in with. As discussed in the previous video, a lot of people identify themselves or who they are by some of their physical traits. You know, the phrase, "I know it as well as the back of my hand," and other such turns of phrases. People are very comfortable and familiar with their bodies. The idea of being put in someone else's body or having your body transformed into various ways is a very frightening concept to people. People like David Cronenberg excel at this in their horror movies, specifically knowing the concept of disfigurement or out-of-body experiences being especially terrifying for people. And this is demonstrated in the game in a way that doesn't become apparent until much later, but still puts you through it in a way that is done primarily through gameplay and not through narrative. It is merely that the narrative gives context to these rather disturbing actions that take place within the game. So, when you first go in here, you land in the pit, you create a clone at the outside of the pit, you swap out, and your original body is left there in that hole. And if it weren't for all the other instances of your clones disappearing, it would have just been left there for the whole time. And you can never get it back because it dissolves. From that point forward, you're just a clone in a long series of other clones that have been used to navigate this place. And this is something that can be very confusing for people, because from that point forward, all these bodies are relatively the same, and some might even argue that because of things like brain structure, chemistry, memory, so on and so forth, they might argue that, for all intents and purposes, they might think the same. To go back to a previous notion, I argue that consciousness and identity and individuality are not necessarily because of your traits, whether they be mental or physical. They're based entirely on your perception. Because, I had stated earlier, it's not your body, because you left your body behind and yet still here you are in this game, by the end of it at least. Having survived all this, having in one way or another, not literally, but in a sort of twisted way, killed yourself over and over again to reach your end goal. Killed many, many people just to get where you are. But up until you had this revelation, you knew that it was just you, not someone who looks like you or physically is you, but happens to have the same physical makeup as you. But you're perceiving it through that body, so it's all the same. And this kind of mirrors a moment in Soma, when you get towards the end game. One of the people who are inhabiting the astronaut that you're chasing decides to use the swapper on one of the rocks, specifically the large head-shaped one, who is interpreted as a sort of server, so to speak. All the other thoughts are chained through this one. Think of it as many people using the same Wi-Fi, so to speak. So they swap consciousness with this one. And it seems to overwrite the minds of all other watchers from that point forward. For when you proceed, you begin to hear lines that were previously stated by the astronaut being repeated by every single watcher that you pass. One of the more eerie ones being, this astronaut can barely even think beyond what they've thought before. They think that they're still them. They don't think, I am now trapped in the body of a rock that can't move and can't perceive anything. It's just their own thoughts. And they think that everything is completely normal. They don't know that their hands are missing, their feet are missing, that they don't have a physical form anymore beyond this rock. Their mind is just spread out upon this network of stones. And it's all the same. Because of the human mind, you are yourself merely because you perceive it to be as such. This comes to a head later in the game, in which a rescue ship comes down. And they initially come out to help you, but they are unable to, for reasons that are communicated to them. And you have an option. There are two endings to the game. You can either jump into the pit beneath you, and thus end your life for good, knowing that you will not be able to survive much longer now that rescue has left. Or you can swap into the body of the person who is about to leave, who came to rescue you. And this plays out as you think. If you jump off the cliff, you get a few little messages from watchers as you pass by, wondering about what's going through your mind as you decide to end your life. Or, if you swap into the rescuer, you get back onto the ship, and you leave the mind of the person who came here to rescue you and then had to abandon the mission in the body of the astronaut who you were in before. And you go onto the ship, and you try and act like nothing is wrong. And the people are suspicious, because you're not quite acting the same. You're not talking, which is especially concerning for them. But they don't quite notice anything for the time being. At least nothing to tip them off to what's really occurred, because they don't know what a swapper is, for clarity. They don't understand anything about this, and they just take off. And it really is kind of disturbing to think about either of these endings, in the sense that nobody really understands what's going on in both situations. When you end yourself, the watchers don't understand the concept of death. They merely think of it as the cessation of thought. And when you get rescued, they don't understand what has just happened to their friend. They think their friend's just acting a little bit odd. Because, as I said before, if you don't know that there's a different perception of consciousness in there, for most people, what difference does it make? It does make a difference. I want to make that clear towards the end of this. It does make a difference from a personal point of view. From a subjective point of view, it means everything to the people who would experience these things. But from objective reality, most people can't tell the difference. Most people would not be able to accentuate a difference. It's like trying to explain colors to a blind person. You just don't get it. Because if they act the same, and they have the same memories, and they have the same physical makeup, why aren't they you? And you say, well, of course it's not me. I'm me. And no one else can be me but me. Even a clone, even a twin, even if it's say, someone else from, like, say, a time travel scenario where it's you from the future. Like, that's not me. That might eventually be me, but for the time being, it's not. And it's this weird kind of egocentric notion that drives all this forward. That you can't be the sum of your parts. You're not even some of the things that you are. You're not even half the things that you are. You are none of the things that you are except for one, and that's just, where am I looking at from right now? Where am I thinking these things right now? And wherever I happen to be, if I'm in another body, if I'm in another place, or if I'm in a different location, no matter any of these circumstances, wherever I perceive reality is where I am in a metaphysical sense. Perception is consciousness, it's cognition. Perception is identity. And this game can do that because when you play through the game, you do end many lives. You do take over the consciousness of many people in ways that seem, for the most part, kind of silly. The one or two times that you have someone die, at first it seems kind of gruesome because of the snapping that you hear when they hit the ground, but eventually it becomes kind of goofy in the sense that you just see it as like a physics engine thing, the same way you see any other time that someone in a open world game falls off a cliff or falls down some stairs. There's plenty of compilations out there of hilarious falls in video games, and it doesn't really sink in because we're not supposed to think about this stuff. There's so many people who have this notion when they're making games or reviewing games that gameplay and story can be completely segregated, and that in some cases story is completely irrelevant. There are people, even in universities, who state when they're teaching people how to create games that story is either completely secondary in regards to priorities, or it shouldn't even be present. Make gameplay first, write a story around it if you want, or just don't write a story at all. And this is a shame because games don't have to be like movies necessarily. Because that's what some people assume when we talk about games moving forward as a medium. They assume that it means that we have to make them more like films, or TV shows, or any other thing. And sometimes they interpret this as making every game similar to Heavy Rain, and that it just becomes like an interactive movie as opposed to a game that actually has some cinematic elements. And we don't need cinematic elements for a game to be good. There are games that have amazing stories and yet still look just like video games without any of the cinematography flourishes or any of the lens flare or film static, any of the film grain effects, anything else that's present for things that tend to be more film-like. The presentation styles of Heavy Rain or Beyond Two Souls, some of the marketing behind The Order 1886, all these things aren't necessarily required for things to have a better story or better presentation, but the respect of a medium is based off of what you have at the beginning and what you move forward from. And some people don't want it to move forward from where we are because games are engaging enough as is. The notion I'm trying to put forward, though, is that you can use gameplay to push forward a narrative without necessarily telling a story, and that you can still tell a story while having compelling gameplay. And blending these two elements together is the way that we move forward in games. Not by anyone's specific metric, not just by my pretentious, lofty, symbolic notions of themes in games. Games don't have to have theming or symbolism akin to what I discussed previously with Silent Hill and the various lore and symbolism that's present in those games. Not everything has to be a head trip. It doesn't have to be all psychological to be good. We want games to be made for its audience in a way that seems well constructed and well thought out. This isn't to say you can't have games that are, quote unquote dumb, with just fun shooters or fun simple platformers. But you can put thought behind them, and you can put effort behind them, and if you have them able to convey more thoughts than just the ones that are on the surface, we can truly make games something that is memorable and respected. Because even the most respected of games, even the most respected of narratives within games, still does not have the kind of mass appeal or mass acceptance that movies, TV shows, books, and plays have. You'll hear people on the street, they'll say things along the lines of, well, this movie had a great story, this TV show had a great story, same with this book, this thing. If you asked a regular person about if they heard about any video games that had a good story, they won't know what you're fucking talking about. You know what they think about? They think about, oh man, what kind of story is there in Pac-Man, in Mario? Or all they play is Wii Sports. And they're like, oh, I didn't think those little bobblehead dudes could talk. They don't have this context. And the only reason why any of these things have a context is because they're widespread. Because movies, they started off as little tiny booths. Little tiny things, that, well, tiny in the sense that they were the size of like a refrigerator. And one by one, you'd stick your head in, and you'd see what was like the late 1800s equivalent of a GIF. And you'd have to pop in a dime or a quarter or something like that to see that. And that was entertainment at the time. That was riveting. It was moving pictures. That was magic at the time. But they moved on from that. I'm gonna link an article that was posted in relation to Soma that specifically details this phenomenon, in which films went essentially from being very expensive gifts that could only be viewed by one person at a time to grand, sweeping narratives with budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars, and it pioneered some of the best stories to ever come out of the human mind. And yet video games have, for all intents and purposes, stagnated. I won't go into it too far in depth, but in short, they detail what I said before, in that interaction, thus the pinnacle of video games in and of itself, the thing that makes video games exclusive from TV shows and cartoons and movies, is your ability to interact with it. And that this alone is engaging enough to where some people don't need it to be any more than that. And that it can be so much better. Thank you very much for watching my series on the themes of transhumanism. If you like my content, please feel free to subscribe to any of the channels listed below, as there will be more content in the coming future. Feel free to comment your thoughts on these videos or on the topics discussed, as any discussion on these is highly appreciated. And for those of you who are worrying about some of these videos being a little bit too dark, dreary, pessimistic, and nihilistic, don't fret too much. For the next series of videos are going to be much more entertaining in a more lighthearted sense. I'll see you next time.